Hi, my name is Caitlin Kelly, and today I will be discussing the horses of St. Mark from St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. Specifically, I will be talking about how Venice received these horses, the significance of their placement on the facade of St. Mark's, and their integration into the Venetian myth in regards to Venice's religious authority and cultural link to both Constantinople and Rome. The horses of St. Mark were originally a triumphal quadriga from Constantinople that was looted during the Fourth Crusade. The target of the crusade was Jerusalem, a landlocked city difficult to march a European army to without the significant aid of the Venetian navy. Of course, the Venetians wanted to be paid for this service. They eventually settled on a contract in which the lords would pay ahead of time per head in their army. Due to unexpected numbers, however, the vast majority of the lords were unable to pay the Venetians to the tune of 33,000 marks, and eventually ended up stranded outside of Constantinople. At this point, Dandolo and the unpaid and hungry army decided to sack the surrounding area in order to make payment. The first city to be sacked was the political enemy of Venice, Zara. This was heavily criticized by the Pope, as they saw it as a power grab that used the religious authority of the crusade to further Venice's own political ambitions. In fact, the Pope tried to forbid the crusade from sacking the city, but he was ultimately unsuccessful. However, the loot from these smaller powers was not enough to pay the debt owed to Venice, and the Fourth Crusade sacked and looted Constantinople, which had been refusing to feed and shelter them. Many of Constantinople's treasures and artisans, including the horses of St. Mark, were sent to Venice. A significant portion of these ended up on the seaward-facing facade of the Basilica of St. Mark, which was then mostly plain brick or terracotta decoration. Most of the decorative elements of the facade were added in the years immediately following the Fourth Crusade. The horses, however, were stored in the arsenal for 50 years before being placed on the facade, not by Doge Dandolo, but by Doge Zeno. Historically, St. Mark's had been used by the city of Venice to establish primacy and to emphasize the historical importance of the comparatively young city. Many of the core elements of the basilica, such as the Byzantine-style plan with a Western-style hall crypt, emphasize its cultural connection to both the Byzantine and Roman empires. Furthermore, the narrative of St. Mark himself is tied into Venice's complex relationship with the two powers. St. Mark was a stolen relic, taken from Alexandria in 829 BCE by merchants who smuggled him out of the city under a shipment of pork, which the Muslim occupants would not touch. Venice capitalized on the ownership of these relics through the Predestino narrative, which states that Venice was predestined to be the resting place of St. Mark. In addition, the adoption of St. Mark as the patron saint of Venice had political motivations. In addition to establishing a history for Venice, the replacement of Venice's previous patron saint, the Greek Saint Theodore, with St. Mark provided a way for Venice to distance themselves from the religious authority of the first Greek Byzantine Empire and later, the power of Rome and St. Peter. Now, let's go back to the horses of St. Mark and their placement on the facade of the basilica. The horses fit into this aforementioned narrative of drawing on the cultural history of Rome and Constantinople. After all, the triumphal quadriga came from Constantinople and is an image that originated in Rome. However, the placement of the horses is more than that. It also fits into Venice's history of using St. Mark's to establish religious authority separate from either Constantinople or Rome and to paint themselves as religiously righteous in their actions. As you can see in this image, the four horses of St. Mark are positioned in one of the most prominent places on the basilica. They are also directly beneath the statue of Christ in a way that Christ appears to be driving them. This lists into an existing iconography, that of the Roman triumphal parades, in which the figure driving the triumphal quadriga was the righteous and victorious, the conquering emperor-general. By placing Christ in this position, Venice implies that he is their general, that Christ has led them to victory, and that Christianity dictates their every choice. In the context of Venice 50 years after the Fourth Crusade, still dealing with the fallout of Dandolo disobeying the Pope and actively fighting rebellions in Zara, this is a very important message. By taking the symbols of triumph that they had looted from the controversial Fourth Crusade and placing them in the context of Venice's religious narrative, they used the horses to establish religious righteousness and emphasize Venice's pious motivations. This fits into the aforementioned overall tendency of Venice to use imagery to establish the Venetian myth, that of history, justice, and authority. In short, the horses of St. Mark, while they might seem unconnected to religious narrative, were not placed on the facade of the basilica simply because they look good there. They are an important part of a conscious, religiously centered narrative that Venice used in their socio-political relations.